I want to just then share with you briefly some of the evaluation that we performed in order to get a sense of how each of those would impact things. First, we looked at traffic. And again, because a couple of our alternatives involve taking away one lane of traffic northbound, we needed to give a sense of what that would mean operationally, not just today, but also as we look out, part way into the overall design life of our project. So, generally speaking, if you look at these two lower curves, this is all calendar year 2010. Those two lower curves that pretty much mirror each other at the bottom, that's our Saturday and Sunday traffic in both directions on I-794 / the Hoan Bridge. Not surprisingly, this blue one that you see, that's what we have during the weekday. Those two peaks are probably recognizable to anybody who drives. And this is the morning peak and the afternoon peak. Overall, we have 48,000 vehicles a day. And in the morning, we have about 4,500 vehicles. And of those, nearly 78% or roughly 3,500 of those are heading northbound. So there's a lot of folks heading into towards downtown and beyond there in the morning. And then in the afternoon, it's kind of a similar deal in which we have about 3,300 vehicles that are heading southbound. Again, from points downtown and beyond, back across south towards Bayview and points beyond there. Now, one of the things that we looked at is, well, we just had, until last Friday, as those of you who have Facebook or tweeted, which we have on our project sheet here, that the construction operations have been essentially concluded up on the Hoan Bridge, and so we're back to 6 lanes total at this time. But drawing upon the extensive traffic data collection that we have for during construction, we did see a marked decrease. And so, certainly kind of like anything, for folks, if they go out there on a given day, maybe they'll see traffic flowing smoothly, maybe they'll see traffic stop and go. But one of the good things that the department has is we have continuous traffic counters, and so we were able to see that actually a fair number of folks stopped taking the Hoan when it was under construction. So, I think over the next several years we'll see that also continue to bounce around as we go through our construction period. Just a little bit about the traffic analysis methodology that we used. 2010 Highway Capacity Manual is the specific tool on our traffic engineer's toolbox that we use for our objective traffic engineering assessment. It's the latest edition of a manual that was first published back in 1950, so about 60 years ago. And as kind of a personal aside, I've been using and applying this methodology since grad school at Purdue in the late 80s, so I'm certainly very familiar with its application and was able to provide good guidance to it as we were moving forward. Level of service is what basically is how we define how well or how poorly freeway operations are going. And it's based on traffic density. In other words, how congested traffic feels at a given point in time, how free you are to maneuver back and forth, how closely vehicles are. I think somebody remarked before the meeting, it seems like people are, following more closely than they used to. Well, as more traffic gets out within a given stretch of roadway, that's what we're going to see. Those peak hour traffic operations, we give it a grade. It's like school, from A to F, where A is the best and F, well, could be improved. Generally, the department's criteria for freeways around the state is to have level of service C during the design year or forecast year peak hour. But for Milwaukee County, again, because of the increased amount of folks that we have here, LOS D is the lowest acceptable design year standard. So how does that translate into where we are today? On our left, alternatives 2A, 3B, and 4, which do not take away a lane of traffic. In other words, it's kind of what we have today. 3 northbound lanes, and as we look at the northbound heading towards downtown in the morning peak, Right now, we're at a middle level of service C. 60 miles an hour. Basically, it's free flow speed. You're not encountering too terribly much congestion, unless, of course, there's an incident or weather or things of that nature. So that, according to our objective criteria, would be acceptable. The two northbound lanes, in other words, under 1A or 1B, we would have LOSD, and it would actually be kind of a low D. Starts to get a little bit more dense, and the way that level of service works is that the speeds really don't start dropping off until you reach that tipping point. And so today's conditions under that criteria would be borderline acceptable. Now, looking out into the future, we looked out 20 years, basically 45 years, and as we go forward in time, there are continued refinements that we do in order to make the traffic forecasts more credible and more acceptable. We actually looked at two growth rates. There's what we call the continued growth rate, which basically is similar to what the sewer pack model developed for us, of roughly less than 1% per year. However, we acknowledge that there's a bit of uncertainty there, and we felt that it was in the public's interest to do a sensitivity analysis. And so we actually developed a second forecast which cranked that growth rate down to about 0.5% a year. And in doing so, those numbers are consistent with the year 2023 forecasts that were developed for the 2002 study, but again, we're looking out at 2035. Not going to bore you with the numbers other than saying that they do grow. Those numbers, of course, are also in the summary report. The bottom line is, again, the alternatives that do not take away a lane of traffic, we still have basically a low level of service C or a high level of service D operation during that morning peak hour. Speeds are still flowing at 60 miles an hour. Under the alternatives 1A and 1B, where we're down to two northbound lanes, there we're at a low level of service E or a level of service F. And again, that takes the speeds down from anywhere from approximately 8 to 13 miles an hour, and that's below the department's standard for Milwaukee County. And once again, that doesn't really reflect the impacts of things like weather or incidents or things of that nature. So moving on to structural feasibility, again, all of these, shall we say, are feasible. In other words, every alternative that you see here that we took forward to this point in the study is something that could be built. However, some of them present, shall we say, a few more challenges than others when it comes to not just the construction of them, but the overall maintaining of that structure moving forward. Alternative 1A, very, very mild. They just require a little bit of widening of one ramp at the south end. On 1B, as I mentioned previously, in addition to that widening at the south end, you would have to go up and over northbound to get into the middle, and then once you get to the north end, you would need to dive down and go underneath in order to tie in at Lincoln Memorial Drive. Now the alternative 2A, as we mentioned, that's the one where at that main tie arch, you would need to go around the outside. There would be some significant retrofits, and again, that's kind of like structural talk, but anytime we start talking structural talk, the cash register is ringing, and again, that's why the price for that one is higher. And it would also require those new substructure reports that we talked about, the red arrow that goes down to the ground. Alternative 3B, again, because it's up above, that weight, the additional weight from that from the shared use path would mean that additional structural retrofits would need to be done along the 2.5 mile length of the Hoan in order to be able to continue to support it. And then finally, alternative 4, which is more of a construction issue, is just that it would need to be done a little bit special just because we need to maintain the Port of Milwaukee's operations. The access locations, as I think described a bit more in the study, getting on and off to the trail under, again, the 1A alternative, the 2A, the 4, in other words, where you're always off to the east side, is relatively straightforward. It's similar to the alternatives that were looked at in the previous study where you kind of go up Car Ferry, go across, come down Lincoln Memorial. So it's relatively straightforward. The alternatives 1B and 3B, as I mentioned, it's a bit more difficult. Because this feasibility study was limited in time and in money and in scope, there are some things that we acknowledge that are still out there that we did not dive into. One of them is long-term maintenance agreements. Certainly, exactly how long would the trail be opened and who would be responsible for cleaning and who would be responsible for snow removal, all of that, not part of our feasibility study. That's an operational issue that once a decision is made, that would something that would need to be discussed. In addition, impacts to adjacent facilities. The Hoan Bridge is up in the air, but there's a lot of stuff down on the ground. And while we attempted to account for that somewhat with our cost estimates, for those of you who wondered what kinds of things would go into a contingency, there are many important facilities here in Milwaukee that are part of that. The Port of Milwaukee, the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District, the Henry W. Meyer Festival Park, as well as other utilities, railroads, local roads, parking lots. There are parts of some of those paths that get pretty close to the shoreline and some of the shore walls that are tied in. It's nothing that cannot be overcome, but just want to make folks aware that as a part of this limited feasibility study, we didn't really get down onto the ground of what some of those impacts would be. And finally, bridge inspection and maintenance considerations. The Hoan Bridge has been, as you may recall from previous meetings, because of how it was designed and constructed initially, it will continue to need to be inspected even after our rehabilitation project that's going to be wrapped up in 2016. It will still need to be subject to a fairly detailed inspection on a regular basis. And so, just so that people were aware going forward what some of those impacts would mean, under Alternative 1A, for instance, when we're doing inspections or maintenance, the path would need to be closed. 1B, again, 1B, we have 2 lanes going northbound. Well, under that scenario, we would actually need to take it down to 1 northbound lane whenever we're doing inspections or maintenance. On Alternative 2A, we talked about going around the outside of that tied arch. There are structural connections and things in there which are very, shall we say, challenging and complicated. And while we can do it from an engineering standpoint, we also have a little bit of unease about covering up some of those critical areas that we can get to right now to actually touch and feel and inspect, that we would no longer be able to do so. Alternative 3B, minimal impact to some of those activities. And finally, Alternative 4, whenever we needed to actually inspect that facility, of course, it would need to be closed. So, that, in 32 minutes, is a Reader's Digest summary for those of you who did not necessarily catch every last aspect of what was in the summary. And a lot of you now are wondering what's next. Well, we are here right now, and as I mentioned, we have these blue sheets that we'd like you to turn in tonight. We're looking to collect those by 5 p.m. on November 30th. So whether it's an email or whether it's these comments and things, that's kind of the period that we've chosen to stop things. And then coming up in the winter of 2011, which we're looking at here by the end of the year, the department is going to release its study decision of what we plan to do, and then flowing out of that, cost agreements and maintenance agreements as needed. And then, of course, the bigger project will continue to proceed on until we get to the summer of 2013, where construction operations will begin for about 3 years.